Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another exciting episode of Fighting Game Thursday. Back in August of last year for just the second ever episode of this weekly ongoing series, we took a detailed look at the history of the original Street Fighter Alpha game, along with the game's surprisingly good 8-bit port that can be found on the Nintendo Game Boy Color. Since making this video all of those months ago, there has been an ongoing demand in my comment section for me to give the same treatment to Street Fighter Alpha 2. I am regularly asked to look at this installment along with a strange port of the game that would be received on the Super Nintendo, late in the platform's life cycle. What improvements did Alpha 2 make to the series, and how well did the game translate when ported over to the 16-bit Super Nintendo hardware? Let's answer all of these questions today. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Street Fighter Alpha 2 and its weird Super Nintendo port. Yeah! After the huge commercial success of Street Fighter 2 and the game's many updated iterations, it was finally time for Capcom to give Street Fighter fans something completely new. This would result in the release of Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams in 1995, a new fighting game developed for the Capcom System 2 arcade board that would story-wise take place halfway in between the first Street Fighter game and Street Fighter 2. This choice of storytelling would mean that Capcom could pick and choose from the rosters of both games to help shape a unique lineup of fighters exclusive for the new Alpha game. Interestingly, Guy and Sodom from the first Final Fight game would also join the roster, proving once and for all that Final Fight, that at one point prior to launch was known as Street Fighter 89, was 100% part of the Street Fighter universe. New to the series too would see the debut of Charlie, Guile's combat buddy who uses the same special techniques, Rose, an Italian female fortune teller who uses an energy known as Soul Power, and Dan Hibiki, Capcom's parody of SNK characters Ryo Sakazaki and Robert Garcia. Graphically, the game took a very different artistic approach to Street Fighter 2, offering sprite work in the game similar to that of which is found in Japanese animes. Changes did not stop here though, as this was literally a whole new Street Fighter game. This would mean the Super Combo system introduced in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo would be refined by adding a 3-level Super Combo gauge. On top of all the new strategies the 3-level gauge brings to competition, other new features to combat were also introduced, such as basic techniques including air blocking, the ability to guard during mid-air, and chain combos. All in all, Street Fighter Alpha gave something fresh to Street Fighter fans. But just 1 year later, in 1996, Street Fighter Alpha 2 would hit the arcades. The question is Street Fighter Alpha 2 a worthy sequel? Or is it more of just a simple upgrade, like with many of the Street Fighter 2 renditions? Let's explore this further. When playing Street Fighter Alpha 2, the most glaringly obvious difference to the first Alpha game is the available roster of fighters. All 13 characters from the previous game all make a return, including the 3 boss characters who are now all selectable on the player select screen. Zangief and Dao Sim of Street Fighter 2 fame would make their Alpha series debuts, along with Gen, another character from the first Street Fighter game. Rolento, one of the boss characters from Final Fight, would also be added to this lineup, along with Sakura, a new character who is a schoolgirl who idolizes Ryu and emulates his fighting techniques. Some of the roster members who appeared in the previous game would also receive additional features. For example, all of the perverts out there could now play as Chun-Li in her traditional, more skimpier Street Fighter 2 outfit. Ooh. Rather than her less revealing Alpha ensemble. Shin Akuma is also present, a more powerful version of Akuma who appears as a secret computer-controlled opponent in the single-player mode. Accompanying the character lineup, the graphics for all of the characters' home stages who appeared in the previous game were completely changed to new ones, an effort Capcom never bothered going to with Street Fighter 2. In addition to the stage changes, characters would also receive new cutscenes, endings, and their voice recordings have either been improved or replaced completely. Speaking of the game's sound, the game's music in general has changed pitch as well. On top of all of this, we need to remember that Street Fighter Alpha 2 is a fighting game, so let's discuss what Capcom decided to do with this one to refine the game's combat further. As expected, mechanically, Alpha 2 retains a very similar system to the previous game, with the largest inclusion being the new custom combo system. Custom combos can be executed when combo gauges are above level 1. These let the player perform any series of basic and special moves to create a custom combo until the timer gauge at the bottom of the screen runs out. Characters all now have 2 different alpha counters as opposed to just 1 as well. Speaking of the game's combat, Capcom senior planner Shinji Mikamiv mentions that in Alpha 2 some new characters were introduced, so in order to maintain the game's balance we had to increase the damage for the normal hits. In addition, this time for Alpha 2 we wanted to focus on the importance of the normal hits and not just the specials, overall making the game more balanced as a whole. Moving past the game's Japanese arcade release, interestingly, before the arcade game would reach other shores, even further changes were made to the game for the international version. This would include the adage of more fighters, including Evil Ryu and the EX versions of Dhalsim and Zangief. These 3 characters were selected by Capcom USA. EX versions of characters handled more like how they played in Street Fighter Champions Edition. Moving on from this, Street Fighter Alpha 2, known as Street Fighter 02 in Japan, would receive a reiteration in Japanese arcades too, this time known as Street Fighter 02 Alpha. This game included the changes made in the international version, but also features EX versions of Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Sagat and M. Bison. Whoever said Street Fighter history was straightforward, eh? This arcade version of Alpha 2 also featured some changes to the game's controls and super gauge mechanics, along with giving some of the characters new moves and including a survival mode. This game would also feature an arranged soundtrack. Porting the game to 32-bit consoles at home would be a fairly straightforward affair, as there would be nothing too graphically challenging within the games that would particularly push the PlayStation nor Saturn hardware. The 2 versions of the game featured arranged soundtracks, but the Saturn version's format allowed the music to be looped properly, just like in the arcade. Further differences though also separate the 2 ports. The PlayStation version seems to have been based off of the original arcade version of the game, whereas the Saturn version seems to be based off of the international version, since it includes Evil Ryu, EX Dhalsim and EX Zangief, who are all absent from the PlayStation iteration. The Saturn game also includes survival mode and an art gallery, which overall, like in most cases with 2D games, the Saturn version of the title would probably appear superior. To further substantiate this claim, EGM commented that both the Saturn and PlayStation versions are great, but the Saturn version has a few advantages, citing frames of animation that were missing from the PlayStation version and the Saturn exclusive illustration modes. A home version of 02 Alpha would also arrive on 2 major 32-bit platforms, both bundled as part of a compilation disc known as Street Fighter Collection, which also encompassed Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Street Fighter 02 Alpha would be retitled as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold in the Americas and Street Fighter Alpha 2 Prime on European systems. This story gets more convoluted by the minute, eh? Capcom sure do love their reiterations of games. Gold, or Prime, or whatever we want to call this title, included the majority of the same features as 02 Alpha from the Japanese arcades, but would once again see content added of its own, most notably the inclusion of Cammy, who was based on her rendition from X-Men vs Street Fighter. Going forward, amusingly, this game would see another console release, this time as a standalone title exclusive to Japan. This would be part of the Satakori Budget Games line for the Sony PlayStation. Away from the 32-bit systems, 1997 would also see a Windows version of the game released, which was heavily based off of the original PlayStation version of the game, but with the inclusion of the arcade soundtrack in WAV format. But this is not the version of the game that tends to draw the most intrigue from fans. The biggest curiosity in the Street Fighter Alpha 2 family arrived 1 year earlier in 1996 on the Super Nintendo, of all things. We have already mentioned that the game was easily portable over to 32-bit hardware, but what about the much more simplistic Super Nintendo? How was this possible, and how did the game function? Well, let's find out. In comparison to the games found usually on 16-bit hardware, Street Fighter Alpha 2 is a game that to run on the system would have to push the system to its limits. And that is before we even talk about the practicalities of such a game being able to fit on a small restrictive Super Nintendo cartridge, as opposed to a CD-ROM, the format the game would appear on to be played on other hardware. To make this tall task possible, the game utilises an SDD1 chip, which allows graphic decompression. Street Fighter Alpha 2 in fact is the only game I can recall running on the Super Nintendo that features load times in order to play the game. Among all the ports of the game on different systems, this version is the most reduced due to the lack of power of hardware, yet Street Fighter Alpha 2 is a highly praised feat on the Nintendo 16-bit console, by being able to go through the limits of what the system was capable of. Generally, this port of the game receives a lot of praise, partially down to its technical capabilities and managing to pull off appearing on the Super Nintendo, making few compromises considering the hardware limitations. Obviously, the Super Nintendo version of the classic game is a lot more compressed than that of its 32-bit counterparts, but the game is much more impressive than what consumers would expect. Changes would include the secret computer-controlled opponent Shimakuma. In this version, the character inflicts double the usual damage to possibly compensate for his unavailability as a playable character. Dialogue edits have been made to the game here and there, and in the North American and European versions of the game, Sodom's name was censored and changed to Katana for rather obvious reasons, due to the even more obvious connotations that come with the name Sodom. This was not the character's first appearance as Katana though, as it was the same name the character went under in Final Fight, on both the Super Nintendo and Mega CD in the West previously, so the renaming was important in terms of consistency as well as just censorship. Speaking of the censorship, more was applied to Alpha 2 when publishing the game on the Nintendo platform. This would include changing Rose's ending so that she no longer was taking a bath. Some stages from the other versions of the game are also missing, including the waterfall stage. Another strange change to the title is that the players have gained the ability to use the custom combo activation at any time, as long as the players have at least one level of their super combo meter available. It is nice to see the amount of effort that was put into this simplified version of this title. All in all, this weird port is an extremely good effort and would have certainly have been a game worth owning for those who had not yet upgraded to next generation hardware. I think in 1996 the Super Nintendo was still my best console, so this game would have been a welcome addition to my game collection on release. Hell, it was a welcome addition to my collection when I got it this decade. All in all, I hope you enjoyed this video and would have enjoyed learning about the many different versions of Street Fighter Alpha 2, along with its impressive 16-bit Super Nintendo port. If this video goes down well, I'll consider giving Alpha 3 the same video attention in the future, a game that certainly deserves it, bearing in mind how many people seem to cite the title as their all-time favourite Street Fighter game. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Street Fighter Alpha 2 and its weird Super Nintendo port. Let me know in the comment section which fighting game you would like to see me cover next. If you want more content like this, make sure you like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive new fighting game content every single week. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full-time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank you all very much for that. Huge shout-outs go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Sponge Matt B, House of the Ted, JD Robbins, Since Spacies, Andrew Bazansky, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computerman, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroReversing.com, Dan Barlio Jr., Joel, and all of my other patroons. Yeah. Ta-ta and farewell.